Coming up on this episode of the All Aboard podcast, in the wake of the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse, we investigate the railroads in and around Baltimore and that travel to the port. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who is slowly becoming a highly trained broadcast specialist, and I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And for the second time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, I know for the last several weeks we've been promising you that we would go and talk about luxury trains, and I promise you that we will in fact talk about luxury trains. But as I woke up this morning, I got an alert from the Wall Street Journal that told me something was just a little bit amiss in the world, and by now you've probably heard a little bit about it. That would be the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, Maryland, has collapsed. And it collapsed because a ship called the MV Dolly, named for Salvador Dali, ran into it at slow speed. And apparently this was due to the Dolly, which was being leased by Maersk, which is a very significant railroad shipper, putting a lot of containers on railroads all across the country. Obviously, intermodal COFC, container on flat car shipments. This ship was bound for, I believe it was Singapore or somewhere around the world, and it crashed in to the bridge when it lost propulsion and steering capabilities. So that has thrown just about everything in terms of marine travel and also freight rail into a little bit of a tizzy as they try to figure out how to get around this and get things back to some semblance of normal. Now, for a little bit of information, the Francis Scott Key Bridge was built in the 1970s, and it carried Interstate 695, which is the Baltimore Beltway, between areas known as Hawkins Point to the south and Sparrows Point to the north. So this is one of three ways that highway, so I-695 is what it carried. There's another I-895, which goes through the Harbor Tunnel, and I-95, which goes through the Fort McHenry Tunnel. Those are the three ways that someone on a highway can get across the harbor area in Baltimore. So this is a very important part of the region's infrastructure. Now, what is notable, and I know obviously we're a train podcast, we'll get back there, this portion of the Baltimore Beltway is not as heavily trafficked as the portion to the north, which goes around to Towson and some of the other areas. So it is very fortunate in terms of the lack of people who were exposed to death, quite frankly, because it was lightly trafficked there, and also because this happened around 1 to 2 a.m. when there was far less. But please keep the victims in your prayers. There are people who were working on the bridge, and there were also obviously cars and trucks that were traveling over it at that time. Keep them in your prayers, the ones who've lost their lives and their families. But let's get to a little bit more of the disaster and how this impacts rail. The one thing that's important to remember as we go forward is that the wrecked bridge is now standing in the way of navigation to the Dundalk and Seagirt terminals, which are the two main terminals at the Port of Baltimore. So let's get to it. The port itself is named for Congresswoman Helen Delich Bentley, or Delic, depending on how you pronounce her name. And this is a younger photo of her. She is very interesting. She spent 10 years serving in the U.S. Congress representing Maryland's 2nd District, and she also was appointed to being the chair of the Federal Maritime Commission by President Richard Nixon. She actually got her start as a journalist, and then from there ended up working her way into government service in both the administrative and the legislative side, the executive and the legislative sides. Now, I have an interesting story about her. So I had a chance to get to know the Port of Baltimore a little bit because I was working for Go Rail, and my first assignment was to work the state of Maryland, and of course that included the port. So I went to meet with a variety of officials of all political parties and all parts of the infrastructure one of the people they continued to suggest that I meet with was Helen Bentley. So one day I did, and I met with her in her home in Timonium, Maryland, and she listened politely to my pitch about freight rail and how freight rail was beneficial to the Port of Baltimore, undoubtedly telling her things that she had heard many times because she had said them herself. And then after I finished my pitch, she sat for a moment, and, I wasn't sure if she was going to throw me out, but she very tersely told me that she would not be supporting what I had to say and writing a letter in support of freight rail because in 1952, the Pennsylvania Railroad refused to let trucks on the port. Now, I want to point out this was in 2010. So it was just about 60 years after the Pennsylvania Railroad had refused to let trucks on the port, and she still remembered that and was very upset about it. So on one hand, I said, she really made my day because, of course, she referenced the Pennsylvania Railroad. And as a highly trained rail enthusiast, you love any time that somebody talks about one of the grand old railroads. On the other hand, I was a little bit bummed out that she wouldn't be supporting our efforts. However, to her credit, when I held an event a few years later to celebrate all the people who had supported freight rail at the B&O Railroad Museum, she did attend and, it appeared very much to enjoy the proceedings. So Helen Bentley really was a great friend of the port, worked very hard for it, and in that way, she was very much a benefit to freight rail in the latter years, and we're talking about Penn Central, Conrail, and now today, obviously, CSX and Norfolk Southern. And I should also add the Baltimore and Ohio in that time. Now, the port itself is managed by, or the majority of the port is managed by Ports America, which is a port management firm, and some of their work includes stevedoring, in addition to, making sure that everything is being accounted for properly and managed properly and so forth. And that is under a 50-year contract with the Maryland Ports Authority. Now, the port is very interesting because when we think of that today in 2024, we mostly think of containers, and the Port of Baltimore does have a fair amount of container traffic there. But a lot of it is what's called RoRo, roll on, roll off, and that includes imported automobiles or automobiles that are being imported and also automobiles being exported, as well as break bulk. So that will be your larger commodities that are not contained in a shipping container and that are going to get broken up and moved in different pieces. The first that we want to talk about, actually before we go there, let me go ahead and show you a map of the area that we're talking about. And of course, we're talking about the city of Baltimore, which, interesting story, the city of Baltimore is one of the few independent cities in all of the United States. The other large one that you might know is another railroad center, which is the city of St. Louis, and it is an independent city because it was created by the federal government. Baltimore is an independent city because in the state law of Maryland, it's actually given the same powers as a county, but it is not part of the county that shares a similar name, which of course is Baltimore County, which is roughly almost entirely around the city, but does not include it. So as I've been vamping here, I was queuing up our map of the city of Baltimore so that you can see the rail lines. Now, as you look here, you'll see that we have to the north, you have CSX, which is their Philadelphia subdivision, and that runs between the Baltimore area and obviously Philadelphia. That is going to be a critical line as we move forward because the Port of Philadelphia is expected to be one of the areas that will in fact receive additional traffic from the Port of Baltimore while they work to clear out the wreckage and get it reopened. Now, that is the green line that you see going through Rosedale and heading to the north of the map. Now, excuse me, I had to take a little bit of tea here. Just to its south is Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, as we like to call it, the main line, Philadelphia to Washington. That is the Pennsylvania Railroad's route, and it has freight operated by Norfolk Southern, whereas Amtrak provides the passenger service. Commuter rail on that line is operated by MARC, which goes as far as Perryville, Maryland. Now, Norfolk Southern operates up this line as a main line also as far as Perryville, where it gets on what's called the Columbia and Port Deposit Line, a former Pennsylvania Railroad branch that takes its traffic into Harrisburg. You'll notice that as you get into this area, you see this yellow trackage that says PBR. And no, that is not Pabst Blue Ribbon. That PBR represents the Patapsco and Back Rivers Railroad. That is now known as Trade Point Rail for Trade Point Atlantic, which is the former Sparrows Point steel facility, steel plant. Now, this has been the plant, unfortunately, has been closed and largely demolished, but the area has actually been redone as a trade hub and industrial park. And it's actually a very much a thriving part of the area, which is dramatically a contrast to the decline of Sparrows Point, which a variety of companies came in, including the Russian Severstal, to try to keep that facility going. And eventually it did close roughly a decade ago, but it is nice to see that something good has come of it. Now, as you get into this area, you see where it says Dundalk. That is a neighborhood within Baltimore, and that is the location of both the Dundalk and Seagirt terminals. These terminals are served by Norfolk Southern and CSX, although the arrangements that get there vary, and we'll go over those in a little bit. This red line that you see is the Canton Railroad. Now, the Canton Railroad was originally an independent railroad that was developed to serve a variety of terminals or a piece of land largely in the Canton area of Baltimore, because according to its history, both the Pennsylvania and the Baltimore and Ohio weren't terribly interested in going there. Well, as time went on, you got to the 1980s, and the Canton Railroad ended up being sold to the state of Maryland and managed by or overseen by Maryland DOT. However, it continues to operate largely as an independent railroad. The interesting thing that you rail enthusiasts, or my fellow rail enthusiasts, I should say, would note is that the Canton is a very easy railroad to Railfan. So if you go into that section, depending on when they're running, there's plenty of space for you to get photos in the area where they keep their engines, and also along their operation, which is only 6 miles of main line. Very easy to see a lot of what they're doing, and a lot of their operation largely does consist of port traffic that is turned over to Norfolk Southern, although it is possible for them to turn over traffic to CSX as well. Now, moving a little bit more to the south, or I should say the west, you see Amtrak, the former Pennsylvania Railroad, does of course go right through town before turning south, whereas you also see CSX coming through here and then down it through the Howard Street Tunnel, which is not exactly shown here, but that area is there, and then also going south. The reason why this is in a little bit of an orange hue is because this includes Mark's Camden Line service, which runs from roughly the Camden Street station right near Oriole Park at Camden Yards on the other side of the famous warehouse that you see in most of the shots of video of baseball taking place there. The ballpark behind it's just on the other side there, and then those trains run south into the Washington Union Station. Now, it's important to remember also that CSX, as they go south from Baltimore, they have 2 lines. One is the Capitol subdivision, which is the line you see here going through Elk Ridge and Harwood Park. This goes down to Washington, D.C. A large number, and I would say actually now the majority of CSX's freight trains that are headed to the west, and that is in this instance areas such as Brunswick, Cumberland, Hagerstown to a certain extent, and also then Pittsburgh and eventually Chicago. The majority of that traffic does now run south to Washington, D.C. on the Capitol subdivision before turning west on the Metropolitan subdivision and going through Point of Rocks, where it meets this route here, this green route that does not have Mark on it, and that is called the Old Main Line. That is, in fact, the original main line of the Baltimore and Ohio, and it is used also for a substantial amount of freight, but nowhere near as much as the Capitol and the Metropolitan subdivision routing. And I do apologize to those of you who are listening on Spotify, Apple, and otherwise, but we will have a link to this map in the description if you'd like to better understand the geography. But I wanted to make sure that we did this so that it's clear that you, whether you're listening or watching, can understand that Baltimore is a very important railroad area, despite the city not quite having the prominence that it did in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. So the disruptions that you're seeing or will be seeing as a result of the bridge collapse will have a wide-ranging impact. And so understanding a little bit about the territory will help you to see that. Now, let's talk a little bit about the terminals, the rail terminals that are at the Port of Baltimore. The first is the Dundalk Terminal, and it's served by both CSX and Norfolk Southern. It consists of 9 tracks, 4 of which are for loading, 4 for storage, and 1 for service. And that's 29,000 total feet of trackage. The next is Seagert. And Seagert includes containers, and this is a quote from their website: containers, automobile, farm, construction, other roll-on, roll-off equipment. Also includes wood pulp, steel, and break bulk. So this terminal, Seagert, is served by Norfolk Southern. However, CSX has access through what they say are, quote, local interchange agreements. And I'm going to admit a little bit of ignorance here. I have not seen or read those agreements, so I'm not sure exactly what form that takes. It could, based on the language, mean that Norfolk Southern is actually responsible for moving the traffic around in the yard area, receiving it from the shipper or getting it off of the ships, and then interchanging some of it to CSX based on customer preference. It could also be a trackage rights agreement where CSX has the ability to come in and then serve the customers. I do not know, but I can tell you that I will endeavor to find out and share that information with you in a future episode. Now, as far as capacity is concerned, the Seagert terminal has more than 50 spots for auto racks, over 30 spots for boxcars, and a machinery yard with unit train capacity. Now, it also has a separate heavy rail spur that runs along berth 5 and 6, and that gives it the ability to do direct lifts between ship and rail. Now, I want to point out how critical that is. And by the way, majority of that is quoted there from the Ports America site. I've stressed this in previous episodes. In a lot of cases, when we have ship to rail, there is not much in the way of actual on-dock rail. And on-dock simply means that the track comes right up next to the ship, and goods or containers can be removed from the train and put on the ship, and vice versa. That's relatively rare. And so in most cases, what you'll end up with is a situation where something, whatever the lading is taken off the ship and it is put onto a truck for drayage or movement by truck to a rail head, which will be somewhere else within the terminal. Now, so seeing that Seagert has a portion of this where you can go directly from rail to ship, so on-dock rail is a very, very important asset for the port. And it also says that berths 5 and 6 can support a maximum load of 71,500 pounds per axle. So that is fairly substantial in terms of weight capability, and that really does give the Port of Baltimore certainly a leg up in that respect over other areas that don't have that capacity capability. Now, there's also, along with the Dundalk Terminal, a Dundalk Marine Terminal packaging that's served by Norfolk Southern, and then there is North Locust Point, which is served by CSX. Now, there are a few associated terminals that are around the port area, and the first is the Consol Marine Terminal. Now, for that, for those of you who are watching on CP5 Cam, I'm going to give you one of my favorite pictures that I took here. This one, for those who can't quite see, are 2 very large coal piles with a pair of Norfolk Southern -9s, or in their parlance, D9-40CWs that are sitting right in the middle. That is at the Consol Terminal. Now you're probably wondering, those you could see it, well, hey, Phil, how'd you ever get that shot? You must be an amazing photographer, and I thank you for all of your praise. But the way I got it was during COVID-19. a friend of mine and I decided to take a drive around the port because he was not a big fan, or is not a big fan, of trains, and he wanted to show me how shipping was far more interesting to photograph. So I said, look, this will be great because I love it too. So we went out, and actually I was able to get some great photos, including the thumbnail, because traffic was so low around the area. We could actually stop the car, get out, and nobody would bother us, and take really good pictures. But the Consol terminal, also known as CNX, it is what they call their Baltimore Marine Terminal, and their quote, it is one of two coal export terminals on the eastern seaboard with the ability to serve the largest ocean-going ships in the world, and the only one served by two rail lines, and that is, of course, Norfolk Southern and CSX. It also does break bulk, but the primary thing that Consol, for Consol Energy, does provide is access to coal. It is one of two major coal terminals, the other being CSX's Curtis Bay Terminal on the south side of the Patapsco River and the port and the harbor area. So that is a Consol. The other is the one that we mentioned earlier, which is Trade Point Atlantic, and now that is, of course, served by Trade Point Rail. A couple of other interesting items that I'd like to get into. We discussed the Canton Railroad earlier about what it does. It has a very substantial list of customers, which include Boise Cascade, Apex Oil, Mason-Dixon Sand and Gravel, Lehigh Cement, which itself was part of the Maryland Midland Railroad when CSX spun off some portions of the former Western Maryland main line in Baltimore County, and then also Baltimore, Carroll, and I do believe Washington counties, which form the current day Maryland Midland, since it had a lot of cement traffic there, and Lehigh Cement was a big shipper. It had an equity interest in the Maryland Midland. And to this day, when I go out to Railfan in Virginia, we see a lot of those covered hoppers, short covered hoppers with cement that are moving under Lehigh Portland Cement's reporting marks. And those are in M415, M416, as they end up moving into that portion of Maryland, since that is a train that runs into Cumberland via the metropolitan subdivision that we discussed earlier. But I point all of this out to show the diversity of businesses that are in the port area and utilize the railroad. So when you think about Boise Cascade, that's paper, office supplies, Apex Oil, obviously oil, Mason Sand and Gravel, exactly what it sounds like, Lehigh Cement, you have Archer Daniels Midland, you have a couple of companies that also do ethanol, and ethanol, a substantial amount of that is moved through the area, and we all know that ethanol is primarily used now outside of its original purpose, which is, of course, in beer and liquor and so forth. That's the alcohol there. But ethanol, as we see most of it now, being utilized in motor fuels as an oxygenate, moving through here. So this gives you an idea of why the Canton Railroad not only continues to still exist, but how the traffic and what type of traffic is moving through the port. And this is to say nothing of others such as the break bulk that we were discussing earlier, or the vehicles which are imported and exported. And what you will find very interesting, and I want you to be careful if you try to do it, if you take I-895 north going through the area, as you emerge from the tunnel, you will be able to see a lot of the rail operations on either side of that. I-95 with the the Fort McHenry Tunnel also does offer some pretty good views of some of the territory that we have talked about here as well. But again, please be careful. In fact, I would very much recommend, if you're going to attempt that, please make sure that you are the passenger and have somebody else is driving. And I only say that because I know, as a rail enthusiast, as a highly trained rail enthusiast, it's very easy to see a lot of this and just kind of lose your mind as you're going through. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about where the trains go. Of course, the Philadelphia sub of CSX, which runs northeast out of Baltimore, and that is to the Port of Philadelphia and the Greenwich Yard area. And that is how they pronounce their Greenwich, not Greenwich. That is going to be very interesting because we could certainly see traffic that might go to the Port of Baltimore be relocated, some of it to the Port of Philadelphia. Now, why this is important is we've got to understand the Port of Baltimore, for all of the benefits that we talked about earlier, has one big flaw, and that is the fact that ships cannot sail out of the port and just continue north. So if you have ships that are coming from the south and they are stopping at various ports along the way to unload some of their cargo or take on cargo, they actually have to turn around and go south or go through the C&D Canal, which is not possible for every ship to do. So that is one of the reasons why a lot of shipping companies have favored other ports, such as the Port of Virginia, also some further to the south, Savannah, and so on, and of course the Port of New York and New Jersey, because this meant they were able to make their stops without having to have as extended a trip time. So there will be a fierce amount of competition that will take place over the next several weeks as the port is reopened, and it will be noteworthy to see if this ends up resulting in more rail traffic moving in the north-south lanes, which quite frankly has been fairly paltry, despite a lot of what was hoped for with the Conrail acquisition, because it was believed that when CSX and Norfolk Southern divided Conrail, that you would see a lot more north-south intermodal traffic moving in the I-95 corridor. It is substantial, but it has not quite turned out to be the bonanza that was expected, at least not on CSX. Another segment, of course, we discussed the capital subdivision. It's important to note that obviously that comes down to Washington, D.C., which provides access to Union Station for MARC's trains. But when it gets into the D.C. area north of Union Station, it connects with the former Conrail Landover line, which is the north end of the RF&P subdivision now. The RF&P itself, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac, begins in Northern Virginia, right there in the Crystal City section of Arlington, and proceeds south. So this is a critical portion of the I-95 corridor coming south there. One other thing to note, since we mentioned intermodal trains, I-137 and I-138, as well as I-031 and I-032, are the two main intermodal trains that CSX operates that serve the Baltimore area. Now, there are others that will be in the region, but those are the two main ones that actually do work Baltimore, 137 and 138 going to Chicago and getting their start or terminating, depending on which one, at the Penn Mary Yard. And I-031, I-032 operating in the I-95 corridor from New Jersey to Jacksonville. Now, on the Norfolk Southern side, of course, we've talked about how they operate on the Northeast Corridor. They have locals that operate, such as the Bayview to Havre de Grace local, which is 804. They have intermodal trains that run to Harrisburg and Chicago, but they do run also a lot of coal trains, both loads and empties, and a lot of this does serve the Consol facility that we talked about earlier. Another thing to note, because just to put this a little bit in a historical context, the MDOT has a light rail line that you've probably seen if you've been anywhere near Oriole Park at Camden Yards or been driving along I-83 to head to the north of the city. Now, from the city to the south, it's on the right-of-way of the Baltimore and Annapolis, but as you go to the north, it runs on the Northern Central. The Northern Central was a long time portion of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and when it came to sections of the the Broadway Limited and the National, Spirit of St. Louis. I tried to use an Amtrak era name, but the Pennsylvania era Broadway Limited and Spirit of St. Louis, those trains would be operating their sections to Baltimore and Washington, D.C., would utilize the Northern Central, and they would be where the trolleys operate now. What is so interesting about that, or I should say light rail, what is also interesting about that is this route passes the Maryland State Fairgrounds, which is where you will find us at least once a year, if not twice a year, doing train shows, whether it's the Greenberg train and toy show, or otherwise. So we'll make sure to keep you posted of that. And it's always neat to as we're loading and unloading, to look back and see the streetcars passing behind us, and knowing that at one time that was K4 Pacifics, G5 Atlantics, and otherwise operating down that same route. And the last thing to remind you is, of course, Amtrak on the Pennsylvania Railroad, the main line, Philadelphia to Washington. A lot of great traffic to see there. And of course, they have been initiating, and I say initiating and not initiated because it's taking its time, but a plan to build new tunnels that go south of Baltimore's Penn Station. Now, what we're going to do this summer, because Baltimore is such a great railroad city, we are going to do a Railfan tour. Now, I'm not exactly sure when this is going to happen, and we're going to have to map out the locations because the reality is this could go on for several days. But what I'm currently thinking of is something that includes the B&O Railroad Museum, goes to some of the older locations such as the old Pennsylvania Railroad President Street Depot, the current Baltimore Penn Station, the Streetcar Museum, so that you can see a lot of that and see some of the areas where railroads did operate in the past, and also, most importantly, the Western Maryland Port Covington facility, because that has now largely become Under Armour's headquarters in the area. So there's a lot to see around Baltimore, and we will keep you posted on when that gets set up, because we'd very much like to have members of this audience join us to go on this tour, because all things trains, obviously, I love to talk to you about trains, and you can see my handsome face as we do that, but I also hope that you will have the opportunity to join us on some of these great railroad adventures. Also wanted to share this with you. This was another one of the neat shots that I was able to get in the Port of Baltimore. If you're joining us on CP5 Cam during COVID-19, that is a former, I believe, L&N SD40-2 number 8181, which was just camping out beside some containers as just about nothing was going on, because this was still during the period in May when things were still a little bit on the slower side, and there was quite a bit of a shock then. And also, I want to share one more. This is from railfanguides.us, and this is a great explanation and visual description of what the yards look like and the infrastructure looks like around the Baltimore area. So obviously I want you to go to allthingstrains.com so you can see a lot of what we have, and check us out on YouTube, Rumble, and so forth, wherever you are viewing this, because we have a lot of things linked. But also don't forget, railfanguides.us is one of the best sites out there that you can find to help you as you're going to visit some of these communities to see trains, investigate the operation, and otherwise. And there is one more thing I'm going to do before I let you go. Now, it wouldn't be Baltimore if there weren't crab cakes. And the best place to go for crab cakes is right here, G&M Crab Cakes in Linthicum. Now, what does this have to do with railroads? Well, first of all, you're not very far from Halethorpe, and some great rail fanning on the B&O. Also, St. Denis, which may or may not be a good place to go, because I understand there have been some changes about accessibility, and specifically railfan accessibility there, but it is still a good area to be near if you want to get some good shots of trains, the Mark St. Denis station, and also Halethorpe just south of that, as well as the famous Thomas Viaduct in Relay, Maryland. Now, what you want to do is go get your shots, chase your trains, watch the operations, and then, of course, head on over to G&M. Now, G&M has not yet paid me to do this, but if you're out there listening, please send your boy some money, or at least some crab cakes. We will be back next week with a full special week where we talk about Conrail, because our Monday show will be on Conrail's birthday, April 1st, which was not an April Fool, even though I know there were a lot of rail enthusiasts who kind of wish it was. But I am a big fan of Conrail. I love it. I think it was great. In the Monday episode, we're going to talk about Conrail today. In the Wednesday episode, we're going to talk about Conrail of yesterday. And then on the Thursday episode, where we do a book review, it will be The Men Who Love Trains by Rush Loving Jr., because I also have a little bit of a personal story associated with that book and its author, and so I hope you will tune in to join us then. So thank you so much for being part of the All Aboard podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe, and every day, start your day at allthingstrains.com. We'll see you down the main line, and I hope you have a great day.